So first and foremost, thank you very much, Kirsten, for joining us. Today's session will be on just transitions with Dr. Kirsten Jenkins. Kirsten is lecturer in energy, environment, and society within the Science, Technology, and Innovation Studies group at the University of Edinburgh. Kirsten has a background as a sustainable development and human geography scholar with research and teaching interest that focuses on all things basically related to energy, but more particularly on social justice issues created by the production and use of energy. And besides her work within the university, Kirsten also serves, for instance, as managing the editor for a journal known to many of us, Energy Research and Social Science. We're very happy that you join us today, and as Machtel said, it's already our 15th webinar, and I think it's time for a session on just transitions. Just to provide the structure of the session, we'll start first with a talk for 30 to 45 minutes, and afterwards we'll move on to Q&A. We will use the chat for interaction between each other, but not for questions for the Q&A. When the talk ends, we will take a moment to provide you with a live ask moderation or with a link for the live ask, where questions can be posed and also can be voted, and we will ask the questions that get the most votes. But I will reiterate this after the talk of Kirsten. So once more, thank you very much for joining us, Kirsten, and we're happy to have you here. So without further ado, the floor or the screen is yours.
I'm not sure which is better, the floor or the screen. I couldn't tell you. Thank you very, very much for having me along. I will say to start with that, although I put a joke about it in the chat, I am in rainy Scotland, and as I've described before, many of you join the call, rainy Scotland sometimes means that my internet is a bit dodgy. So if at any time it goes crackly, please feel free to give me jazz hands to let me know. I'm hoping that you can see just a main slide, or can you see my whole screen?
We see the presenter mode now.
Then how do I get you just to do? We'll just go old school so that you don't see presenter mode and go this way. This means that unfortunately I can't see your reaction, so I'll keep cracking jokes, but I can't see you laugh. I'll just pretend that you do. Yeah, thank you very much for having me along and for the introduction. I realised that when this was advertised, it just said just transitions, but I thought I would give a little bit more of a steer and say that it's a personal and a case study perspective on just transitions. And just to say a little bit more about my background in this area, I note that you mentioned established speakers in your introduction of the seminar. I'm not sure how established I am, but I finished my PhD in 2016, and issues of energy justice and just transitions have been my core focus ever since. So I've done quite a lot of writing in this area and employed in a number of different grants that look at the just transition and energy justice issues from a range of different perspectives. And it's something that I'm very happy to dedicate my life to, working towards. As mentioned, I do wear a number of hats.
Sorry, one second. We don't see your presentation yet. Is that
right?
You
don't see it? Oh. Okay, attempt 17. How about that?
Perfect. Yes, there we are completely. Thank you so much.
Good, no problem. Sorry if you can now see the presenter view on the side, but I might keep that there so I can see you, if that's all right. Okay. Yes, as mentioned, I have a number of different hats. Teach at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, work for the journal Energy Research and Social Science, one of the competitors of innovation in societal transitions, perhaps, and also affiliated with the University of Durham as an associate fellow. But the work here that I'm talking about is most relevant to the work that I'm doing at the University of Edinburgh. And I want to walk you through a presentation of somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And to start by really trying to define what a just transition might look like. So a lot of my work is fairly conceptual, more empirical as time goes on, but it is a concept I really have been trying to get to grips with, and one that I think is actually still being articulated and argued and enacted. And so I think there are a number of different ways in which we can define this idea, and I'll run through each of those in turn. So what I'm going to break it down into is perhaps a structure that might be goal-centered, one that's academic and fairly conceptual in its orientation, one that's specifically embedded in policy, and this is something that I'll continually return to, and then something that might look like a combination of both of those, a research and a policy framework that has a particular structure, a particular set of principles. And then what I'll do is end with my own interpretation, which I would loosely call fossil fuels plus. So just to begin at the beginning, goal-centered. I think there are a number of different definitions that could be used here. So what I've done is just choose two randomly from the internet to say that there are pieces of language out there that articulate the just transition in a particular way, that say it has a particular normative orientation, a particular outcome that we ought to be working towards. So if you look at the first definition on this slide, you have language from the European Bank, for example, saying that it's about a green economy, that has to be shared widely, it has to support those that stand to lose, and it narrows that down to a particular set of actors, industry, communities, workers, or consumers. So there you already have fairly prescriptive language around the types of world we're trying to enact through this process. And that process comes up in definitions too. So the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, which many of you may have heard about, has both bits of language. It has a goal towards a greener and a fairer future for all people, but it also says that this is part of a process, that it's a constant travel, an area of trajectory effectively, and that we have to go through this process in partnership with those that are going to be impacted. And if I look back at our work in the energy justice area, we started quite clearly with this language of goal-centered definitions too. We said that energy justice was a fair, sustainable future for all, for example, but quickly moved away from that because we found that, you know, the language of justice was contested, the future that we are imagining is contested, and actually that there are so many different contextual bases and differentials that we needed to give more scope for there to be deliberation. And so you can see academic frameworks which take a slightly different stance. This is just one of many that exist in this area. It's written by colleagues of mine, Raphael Heffron and Darren Macaulay. Darren was my PhD supervisor, so I have to cite him once in every presentation I ever give. And it's just one potential structure. And in this, they try and argue that we can amalgamate climate justice, environmental justice, and energy justice thinking into a just transitions framework. I'm not going to pretend that I fully like this framework, but for the purpose of explanation, they then put in lots of different structures. So they say that justice here is distributive, procedural, and restorative, which is a slightly different take on distribution, procedure, and recognition that you might have heard about previously in energy justice and environmental justice thinking. They say that it has recognitional elements and cosmopolitan, where we're all part of a global network and structure. And they also say, true to geographers all over the world, that it's inherently embedded in space and time. And so in combination, what they're trying to describe is a just framework made up of various different things that are all geared towards the normative description of an energy future. But it gets more complicated again. So when you have that academic and goal-centered definition, there is also a policy strand which is operating in a slightly different way. So COP26 happening in a couple of weeks' time will build on the legacy of COP24. And part of the legacy was that we had this Silesia? Are there any Polish people who can help me? Declaration, which was written for that COP meeting, which was signed by 50 countries in attendance at that meeting, and which gave a really particular definition enshrined in EU policy-making language, that it was about the workforce and the creation of decent and quality jobs for an effective and inclusive transition. And that declaration is one that sits alongside things like the Paris Agreement as a really strong steer of what our climate negotiations and futures should be looking like. As part of the EU Commission work, you then have a different mechanism or definition again called the Just Transition Mechanism, which, as it says there on the slides, is a tool to ensure that what happens in a fair way, leaving no one behind. And that's broken down into a number of different strands of work, all of it with quite heavy financial investment behind it, to include both private sector and public sector investment, and to offer loans in some contexts for particular regions or local bodies and organisations. So again, there are different wheels taking place here. You can already see a number of different stakeholders articulating what a just transition might be in a slightly different way. And whilst there are similarities, I also think there are real tensions. There are geographical tensions around where it's being articulated. There are tensions for which actors are being given attention. There's perhaps a power play in terms of who's leading the charge here. And there's definitely some contestation over the potential future that we're looking at. And then, and I mentioned this as well, you'll also have groups that span those boundaries. So some of the work that I'm doing at the moment, which I'll draw upon later in my discussion as well, is working alongside climate strategy, the organisation, and the Stockholm Environment Institute. And they have a really strong interest in the just transition, and it's something that they've published on before. So the Stockholm Environment Institute, for example, serves as both a research and a policy body to some extent, feeding insights from one half into the other and vice versa, and developing frameworks that are supposed to aid our discussions and our thinking. So they have developed, in a piece of writing in 2020, 7 principles for a just transition, which they think cut across lots of these debates that are going on. So you have things like actively encouraging a decarbonisation, avoiding the creation of carbon lock-in, supporting affected regions, supporting workers, their families and their wider community, and so on and so forth. And again, the language there is largely around fossil fuel workers and communities, but also potentially with ripples that look a little bit wider and further on. And what I want to say here is, I guess, said from a fairly luxurious position of an academic office, and an everlasting reflection that the world is an incredibly messy and entangled place. So we're getting the impression that over the last few years, whilst the language of the just transition is getting more and more recognition, that it's upswelling, that it's being written about more, that it's being debated more in policy spheres, that as it does so, it's getting more and more complex. That, as I say, we have all of these different pieces working in tension and all of these different goals and standards and principles and frameworks, and that whilst there might be a collective interest in what they therefore turn out to be, it also might muddy the water in terms of how we get there. And so I've been thinking a lot, and I will continue to think a lot, around what my take is on the just transition. And my take effectively comes down to what I would call fossil fuel plus. I say this both as a reflection on just the transition altogether, but also my previous work and ongoing work on energy justice. And if anyone wants to ask me why those two concepts are different, it's something that I'm always happy to discuss. But what I will say, just to try and give an effective summary, is that the just transition concept can, in effect, as we have clearly shown across all of these definitions, carry a range of different purposes and contributions. We can clearly see that it's something to conceptually articulate, that it helps us think about distributional issues in terms of the resources we're concerned with, be it oil, gas, coal, tar sands, whatever they are. We can think about the recognitional element of who is affected by those pieces of energy infrastructure or processes of change, and we can think about the procedures. And having that framework or structure, like the one that Raphael and Darren put in place, is something that you see therefore mirrored across loads of different contributions, academically and otherwise. It also is something, therefore, that can become analytical. We can apply this to different case study contexts, which sounds a little bit luxurious as well, treating the whole world as a case study, but we can take this structure and apply it and say, okay, in this context, therefore, what is or is not going well? Which are the good practice case studies where distributive justice is achieved, but recognition isn't? Or where might we better focus our procedures and use that as a tool to analyse the process of change that's happening, and build upon a better future potentially. And also, as we've seen through things like the I'm going to change a different word, the enactment of EU policy, that it can take a decision-making role and have a different structure altogether, where we can potentially guide some of that investment, when we can look across EU member states or otherwise, sorry, UK no longer a member, and try and divert funds. And so that definition, if we're applying that, although it came from energy justice thinking and the writing of Benjamin Sovacool and Michael Dworkin, very much applies to just transition in its potential. And what I will say is that for me, across all of these different potential operationalizations, there you go, and definitions, is that they are united, it would seem quite strongly, by some kind of coherent normative claim. That basically we ought to be doing things better than we currently are. That we do have a concern for fairness, that we do have a concern for justice, however that is therefore defined. But it is one in which the world isn't the world in which we currently live. And that, to me, is a comfort. It's the consistent amongst the tangle, perhaps the pole that's sticking up the middle of all of those electricity wires. And again, if I look at the future and the history of the just transition concept, I do think that it's one that's fundamentally embedded in the work of labour unions. So when I mentioned that I wasn't necessarily enamoured with that academic framework that was put together by my previous colleagues, one of the reasons that I'm potentially not enamoured with it is because I think it's fairly detached from the historical meaning of the term just transition, which was one which came out of labour unions and particular fights for justice in particular contexts, say around coal, and the impacts of moves away from that in particular communities. And I think, therefore, we always have to remember that we start with this thing that we are moving away from, this fossil fuel legacy, this fossil fuel history, and that we are therefore concerned with the alternate, which is our renewable transition as it comes into practice. And that means for me that the core group of concern, the people in need of recognition in a just transition, are those fossil fuel workers and their communities. So, full disclosure, I'm from the north of Scotland, where we have a huge legacy of oil and gas, for example. And if I look at the changing energy landscape where I grew up, it's certainly a landscape where those oil and gas workers in areas like Aberdeen and Shetland are those that are really at the front line of the change. They are the people whose livelihoods are going to be flipped on their head, whose communities are going to take an entirely different shape, and whose network of operation will be altogether different. And so they will always, for me, be the ones that the just transition with that labour union history is there to represent. And of course, it's worth saying too that therefore there are going to be elements of this that are inherently temporal. So those communities have legacies of oil and gas production, coal production, whichever fossil fuel it is that we're moving away from. We're going through a process of really rapid change, and there's argumentation that that should be more and more rapid through things like the declaration of a climate emergency. And we're already thinking in terms of future generations and the legacies that we're leaving. So it's a question of what has come behind from the past, what will come in the future, and how quickly we make that change. And therefore the just transition always needs to be in touch with and reconciled with that temporal element. It's also really geographical. Whenever I describe distributional justice to people and energy justice in particular, and you say things like distributional justice, it's easy to forget or to become fairly detached from the fact that the wind doesn't blow everywhere, for example, and coal doesn't just come from everywhere. It comes from particular locales. There are particular regions or parts of the world where that is the primary source that they have geologically. And therefore, the just transition will not happen equally all over the world either. There will be some places that are naturally disadvantaged, that have perhaps historically been advantaged through their resources, but now will have to take an entirely different trajectory. And so we have to ask questions about where this is happening and what we might do for those communities if those resources are no longer what they draw upon. And then the final thing that it's worth saying is also, if I think of oil and gas, for example, the first imaginary that comes to mind is often of a platform floating in the sea. It's of a tanker, it's of a pipeline, but it tends to be fairly classical. It might even be that worker that we have in our mind that's wearing oil overalls to protect them from the cold and the wind and the rain, that has a hard hat on that's orange for visibility. But actually that imaginary is just one really tiny part of a huge network and a huge puzzle. And the more and more I learn about the oil and gas industry, for example, the more that you hear about the fact that helicopter workers will also be making a transition. They won't be flying people out to rigs, they'll be flying out to wind platforms. They might be flying to different geographical locations. You have the secondary and the tertiary industries that are making component parts that become, composites within a larger energy sector for hydrogen, for example. And they also need to transition. And this system-wide dynamic means that although there is this geographical tendency, there is, for example, an oil and gas community indisputably in Aberdeen in the north of Scotland, there are also many, many networks that come off that cross large geographical areas, including internationally, and that they must also be recognised and supported. But what I will say, and this is where the just transition becomes fairly tricky, is that even if I want to represent that labour union history, that particular group, and those particular pieces of policy or goal-orientated definition, it is something that then inherently becomes greater. So I can see that the way in which the just transition language is being used goes beyond those groups really, really rapidly. It has ripples in terms of recognition and application. Say, for example, towards the way in which oil and gas is therefore used in wider society. So I live in a house where we have no mains gas supply, we have an oil tank, and therefore the oil and gas transition in the UK will mean something very material for me in my own domestic setting. We will have to get rid of that and we will have to use an alternative source of fuel, and that will have finance implications for me. And there are a number of different rural properties where that will be the case. And so the just transition already is something that's looking at that demand side and those communities where it's used. It's looking at our electric vehicle fleet and its complete lack of existence in northern Scotland. And therefore the ripples across wider society. So it's really hard to keep it bounded. And what I'm saying here effectively is that I think to some extent we're losing control of the way in which it's applied, that it is fossil fuel plus, because these normative things that unite us, these normative goals and standards that everyone seems to be interested in, are so rapidly proliferated. Of course, we want fair outcomes for everyone in society, protecting a particular group, but also not saying that they are the only people that should be protected, but we want things to go better for everyone. So I have no idea how I'm doing on time because I now can't see a clock. Am I okay? Good. I just wanted to give a little bit more tangibility here as well. I've talked about it a lot as I've gone along because this is the project that we're working on at the moment. But just to draw a little bit more of a example from our work on oil and gas in the UK, which I'm actually particularly pleased to do, having seen the number of you that are joining from not the UK, but from exciting places all over the world. So hopefully to some of you this will be a relatively new discussion and context. But what we have in the UK is a really, really badly done history of transition. So we used to have a very strong coal market, number of coal fields, a high level of coal dependency. We used to have a really strong shipbuilding expertise, and we used to have a really strong steel industry, which actually my dad worked in as one of his first jobs. I can tell you a story about him nearly blowing himself up at the end. And those are really good examples of where a transition was handled extremely badly. So through a number of different political manoeuvres, poor Margaret Thatcher has made it onto the slide for being one of the people that perhaps didn't do so well in this context. But through a number of different political manoeuvres, those were shut down really, really rapidly, those industries. And what was the primary fault was that there was no replacement industry put in place. It happened largely over a couple of months, weeks and nights in some contexts, that suddenly these coal fields were shut down. And there was no financial support for the workers, and it was something that was highly contested, and it is something still that has huge legacies across the UK. So this report is one of two. There's a previous one that came out in 2014, and this is a later edition, which says, for example, that in the UK coal mining industries, or ex-coal mining communities, there are huge socio-demographic differentials between other parts of the UK. The life expectancy is lower, the attainment in education is lower, the incomes are still lower than average, and the social deprivation across the board is off the charts compared to places where this didn't happen. And so there's an argument when we're looking at what's coming next in terms of oil and gas that we really have to avoid the same mistakes that were made in the past. And it is a context of change. So the UK oil and gas production is in a steady state of decline. We've had large numbers of years of economic dependence on it. It's still a huge contributor to the economy, and it's something that in the North Sea region feeds into UK markets in general, but Scotland in particular as being one of our primary sources of income. But it will have to come to an end purely for financial reasons, because we're exhausting the resource that was there. Alongside that, we do have ambitious renewable uptake strategies, goals, targets and attainment. And that includes in places like consumer homes. So there's a demand side element to this as well, driving that transition away from oil and gas. But still, it's here, and it's something that's highly contested, and I hope that for those of you that are overseas, you get to see lots of the news about how this is being shouted about in the UK and how contentious it actually is. For the bits of the oil and gas sector that are still operating, we have a largely white male workforce distributed across the UK, but also with some pockets of higher concentration in the northeast of England, around Hull and Humberside, and in the northeast of Scotland, around Aberdeen and Shetland. And so we're in a position at the moment where we still have this dependency, we know the dependency has to end, and we have the renewables targets in some parts of the UK that are signifying that there is a significant opportunity for workforce redeployment, that this just transition could happen, and that it's something exciting, and that we need to facilitate this changeover. But also we have the world's most ridiculous political setup. I'm going to try and keep it not too political, but a very challenging and complex political setup with recent exit from the UK, recent exit from the EU, partially devolved government, so the Scottish Welsh government have some powers that belong to us, some are reserved by Westminster. Very different strategies across those different contexts, very different mechanisms to support across those different contexts. So, for example, a Just Transition Commission in Scotland and some form of that in Wales, but nothing in England. And so those different targets and bodies and ambitions are sitting to some extent in tension as we articulate this future for ourselves. And as I mentioned earlier with our supply chains, we're also trying to make a series of changes within the UK, arguably towards a just or renewable transition, which do depend on what other people are doing in the world, which depend on the bits that we can import, the bits that we can export, the supply chains that we need in order to make this happen. And so it's an interesting but challenging place to be. And it's also one that's rapidly changing. So this is a really unflattering picture, and I actually felt guilty for putting it up. Not guilty enough not to do it, but here you have our great leader, Nicola Sturgeon from the SNP, looking a little bit shocking, who came out just a couple of days ago to say that although the SNP, Scottish National Party, have always articulated that there would be a role of oil and gas, that they've supported a Just Transition Commission, but at the same time they've said, but it plays a part in our economy, so we need oil and gas. There seems to be a political shift. She has come out very suddenly and very recently, just in time for COP26, and perhaps to make Boris Johnson look bad, in saying that oil and gas exploration is no longer acceptable, that it should change, that there's no reason that we can continue doing this morally. Whether that means that we don't go ahead with some of the current things that we're looking to explore around the Cambo oil field, I don't know. But nonetheless, it's an interesting political manoeuvre, and one which means that all of these ambitions take a slight different level or place overall. And so in the work that we are doing, we are speaking to a range of different stakeholders from across the UK to understand the opportunities and barriers for a just transition. And I've kept this fully anonymous because it's still work in progress, but what I can just do here is summarise that there are a number of requests that are happening in the UK oil and gas just transition, and that this is what they look like to us so far. So we have an acknowledgement that perhaps when you drilled into Nicola Sturgeon's speech, she might also have given herself that although we want to move away from fossil fuels, it won't happen overnight. They're still incredibly entrenched in our economy and society. That we need support for you across the UK for individuals and communities, and that needs to happen in a much more universal way than it currently is. So Scottish policy here is arguably leading the way above and beyond England. We have different mechanisms in place, we have different commissions in place, but there's an argument from all of the participants that I've spoken to and all the analysis that is taking place that we need to make sure that that's consistent. Otherwise we'll end up with a just transition of some parts of our country and not others. There's language here around the need for skills passports to ensure that workers who are going from fossil fuel workplaces into renewable workplaces can do that as seamlessly as possible, that they don't have to take a new certificate, for example, that says, okay, I'm safe to work on a oil and gas platform, but not on a wind platform because it's slightly different. This is why it's a 10-minute section and why it's different, which is ridiculous because they're basically the same. Basically, that we can make it easier for these people to prove that they have the skills to work across each of those sectors. Something that I'm very passionate about is that this is a process, therefore, of upskilling people that already work in this industry, reskilling them where it's needed into, say, new digital economies or new types of subsea cable or whatever it is, but also gaining new entrants. So if we go back to my mention there that this was a primarily male white workforce, that means that there's a lot that's missing. There's a lot of women that are missing, and there's a lot of ethnic diversity that's missing. And so we need, if we're imagining this just transition to be a fairer, better future, potentially, to bring in huge numbers of new workers that previously weren't represented. This is something to bear in mind for COP, that we also need stronger bridges between high-level policy intention and statements that are made at such meetings and the local level delivery of what that will actually look like. So really clear structures that can be put in place and really clear incentives or funds that can actually enable those. It's all well and good as well to say that we will have a sudden just transition, but we also need something to transition to. So not uncommon to hear that the wind doesn't blow all the time, and therefore that there's an issue with intermittency of supply. So there still has to be large-scale investment in things like storage, and as part of that, supply chain diversification to get us away from these gas networks, for example, that run across most of the parts of central Scotland towards, say, hydrogen or district heating or something altogether different. And for some of the colleagues that I work with, that means that we have to take a really firm decision on technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which might, for some, be used as a way of propping up oil and gas industries by just making them cleaner. The request that we're hearing as well as part of our just transition is that we also need an extension of good practice approaches where they do happen, that we have things like the Scottish National Transition Training Fund, which doesn't exist in other UK contexts, and perhaps that we can use that model or adapt that model or learn from that model and put it in place elsewhere. And then the last one, which I find particularly interesting, is if I ask people, including my mother, if they know what the just transition means, the answer is always no. Or they can give it their own definition, but it might be a slightly unaware or a hesitant definition. And actually, I think we really need to normalise the language here. We can see huge progress in terms of sustainable development and what that means to people. We can see huge progress around climate change and what that means to people and how that's articulated in everyday society and what that means of what we're asking for people like policymakers, decision makers, or industry bodies. And I really do think that the just transition language should be something that's proliferated to the same extent, where we're saying this isn't just a climate change dilemma, this is a social justice dilemma in a slightly different way or in an additional way or in a nuanced way, and that we should be teaching people to ask for the right things, to make it clear what they mean. And I can see some of that happening already, and that's the one bit that potentially makes me feel a little bit more hopeful for COP26. And so, to summarise, with absolutely no idea how long I've taken so far, still good, I just wanted to put in a final slide, which is potential next steps for a just transition. That first point would naturally build upon what I've just said around supporting public awareness, telling the workers what they need to say to some extent, or making them aware of the requests that are reasonable and the language that's happening here and what other people are facing, telling communities that they should be using this language because it has structures and frameworks and potential money behind it, and that can help them. And I constantly say this in presentations, but if there was a David Attenborough of the energy justice or just transitions world, I actually think that would be hugely helpful. So if anyone wants to do a BBC documentary and has a really soothing voice, please let me know. I'll put you in touch. I also think we need, as a research community or a community of practitioners and interested parties, further case studies on leaders and laggards of where it's going well and where it isn't. It's interesting to see participants on this call from, say, the US. I think someone was from Australia, someone was from Nigeria, and we've all got really different bases or backgrounds, component parts to our energy mix. And we could all draw really interesting case studies, I think, on where there's still oil and gas dependency or where there's a landscape of question mark nuclear, question mark coal in Australia, and so on and so forth, and look at those different tensions and learn from each other to draw on the cross-country comparisons that I mentioned in bullet point 4. That will help us, going back to bullet point 3, with sharing best practice models, ones that are policy relevant and policy oriented, I think, because they will also really help us put pressure on. And again, pressure on, being a landscape that is particularly interesting in terms of activism at the moment, with things like Insulate Britain, and I'm not sure how far across the world that's made it, but it's a current active campaign in the UK for energy efficiency standards to be raised, which involves lots of people sitting in the middle of motorways to stop traffic. We have things like Fridays for the Future, we have things like Extinction Rebellion, we have a letter that was signed by 70 experts, climate scientists in the UK, that was published in The Independent a few weeks ago, that was asking for a quicker move away from oil and gas, and suddenly we have Nicola Sturgeon saying that's what we want to happen. That we, whether it's true or not, will give that some real ambition and some lip service, and represent that kind of tidal shift against technologies and towards a better future. And so I think, at least in my lifetime, I can see more and more progress being made there, and I'm feeling more optimistic than I am not, which is possibly a sign of just having a good day. And I think that's where I'll leave it for now. I put my email address, my Twitter account, and my LinkedIn account if you ever want to get in contact with me. And what I will say, just to close, is this is very much my opinion, as I opened with. I don't want this to be a set of Q&A as if I'm the expert and I have the right answer. I'd really love to debate with you and to hear your own perspectives. And I'm more than welcome you telling me that I've missed a lot and that I need to learn more.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. I think that was really interesting. And I will put also the live ask tool now in the chat, and I suggest that we take like a minute or two for Kirsten to take a breath, for us to think about the questions we want to ask and to continue in the Q&A. But before that, I also want to thank you again, Kirsten. I think that was really nice, and I think that was also some some aspects where I think that you opened up also a whole perspective within the UK that I am aware that it exists, but I haven't been thinking about that in this particular case. So yeah, thanks for that, and for many more of the insights.